The Dead Three, the name given to the dark gods of Bane, Bhaal, and Myrkul. What have they been up to lately? In this video, I will be going over their history. Now, in my last video, I covered their history as mortals and how they ascended to godhood, which you should definitely check out. So for this video, I won't be covering them as mortals since I already did that, and I will be starting at the beginning of their divine ascension, and then working all the way up to the current 5th edition time period of the 1490s DR. So, according to the DM's Guild book Lord of the End of Everything, the Dead Three became gods in -335 DR, just 4 years after the fall of Netheril. Little is known about what they did over the next 1500 years or so, but we know that they successfully reigned over their respective portfolios. Myrkul oversaw the dead and forced prayers and offerings to him at funerals out of fear. Bhaal, as the Lord of Murder, garnered prayers from assassins, and Bane reigned as the god of tyranny, hatred, and strife, and ruled over Bhaal and Myrkul to an extent. Bhaal was able to gain the servitude of Loviatar and Talana, making him quite powerful, and since Bhaal is subservient to Bane, Bane also had the servitude of those two. Additionally, Bane's clergy went on to play a big part in the creation of the Zhentarim, a shady mercantile organization that ruled over Zhentil Keep. In the year 75 DR, the great seer Alando arrived at Candlekeep with many prophecies, one of which was that Bhaal would become aware of his eventual death as a god and breed with mortal women in order to create descendants as a contingency plan. This plan would become true by the mid-14th century DR, as many of Bhaal's descendants, called Bhaalspawn, were around then. Bane did something similar, although he only had one child, and it wasn't with a mortal, it was with allegedly a true Tanari. This child's name was Iyaktu Zvim, and he arrived in Westgate in the year 710 via an abyssal portal, and then conquered the city, reigning for 24 years. The Time of Troubles. Lord Ao is the overgod of realm space. An overgod is essentially the god in charge of the gods. All gods and primordials of Abir Toril were subject to him. When he sundered Abir and Toril, giving them to the primordials and gods respectively, he crafted the Tablets of Fate. These were 2 stone tablets that maintained the balance between the forces of law and chaos, acted as a barrier between Abir and Toril, and recorded the names and purposes of every god and primordial. Bane and Myrkul believed they held some of Ao's power, and so they stole them in 358 DR, believing they could empower themselves, and then hid them on Faerun. However, this was incorrect, and the tablets did nothing for them. Ao then called upon all the gods and asked who stole them, and of course Bane and Myrkul did not speak up. So, angered by the gods' growing apathy of their duties, Ao cast down all the gods to Toril as mortals. Myrkul appeared in West Faerun and found one of the tablets and brought it to his realm in Hades. Bane, later accompanied by Myrkul and Bhaal, rallied the Zhentarim to hunt down the other tablet, which was being held in the Temple of Torm in Tantris, called the Temple of Torm's Coming. Myrkul then performed a mass death spell that killed Bhaal's assassin followers, and then Bane's clergy performed a ritual called the Stealing of the Souls, which siphoned this massive amount of life essence that had been released. This power was then used to empower Bane, turning him into a giant armored statue called the Black Brother. The reason he used Bhaal's assassins is because he had already lost quite a few of his own soldiers and needed the remaining ones for the attack on Tantris, and he needed Myrkul's priests for the ritual and the attack as well. Also, these souls needed to be aligned with their cause or they would be difficult to control. So he chose Bhaal's worshippers as they would be aligned and because they had failed him multiple times during the Time of Troubles. Now, I'd like to point out that while Bhaal's assassin worshippers were killed to empower Bane in the novel Tantris, the sourcebook Cloak and Dagger says that this was done to empower Bhaal. As far as I can tell, this seems like a contradiction. You could explain it away as saying that at a different time, Bhaal used some of his worshippers in a separate ritual, and then later Bane used his worshippers for him. Or you could explain it away as that that's just what Bhaal tells his clergy, as he doesn't want to appear weak and subservient to Bane, but I'm not really sure how else to explain that. Anyway, Bane in his new powerful form marched towards Tantris, but was met by a giant-sized, lion-headed Torm, who had also empowered himself with thousands of lives, although these ones were willing. They were all worshippers of Torm in Tantris who had sacrificed themselves for this. Bane and Torm destroyed one another, and that is how the first of the Dead Three died. Cyric, who is not a god yet, accompanied by the wizard Midnight, was also looking for the Tablets of Fate. Due to these conflicting goals, Bhaal attacked them and was killed by Cyric wielding the sword Godsbane, which was really the avatar of Mask, the god of thieves. Midnight secured one of the tablets in Blackstaff Tower in Waterdeep, and then Myrkul, who had the other one, opened a portal from Hades beneath the Yachting Portal Inn, and rode through the city with hordes of undead and secured the final tablet. He then ascended the Celestial Stairway with both tablets, but then was disintegrated by Midnight. A sliver of Myrkul's power then entered the Crown of Horns, an artifact of Netherre's invention being held within Blackstaff Tower. And at this point in 1358 DR, Bane, Bhaal, and Myrkul were dead, and were given the nickname the Dead Three. Before this, they were known as the Dark Three. Their power and portfolios were absorbed by Cyric, who ruled all three domains and gained most of their worshippers. As a god, he directed his Zentarum followers to snuff out any remaining Baneites in an event known as the Bane Death. In 1368, he began the Second Bane Death, where his clergy killed Bane worshippers all throughout the Moon Sea. By 1369, Cyric had gone mad, lost the portfolio of the dead to Kelemvor, lost the portfolio of tyranny, hatred, and strife to Bane's son, Iactu Zvim, and had diminished in power significantly. The Bhaalspawn Crisis. Now, earlier I mentioned that Bhaal had spread his seed as a contingency plan in the event that he is killed. These descendants were called Bhaalspawn, and were partially divine beings that were driven to commit acts of murder. Bhaal's plan was for them to kill each other, and then when none were left, the scattered essence of Bhaal would accumulate, and his high priestess, Amelisyn, would perform a ritual to resurrect him. Truthfully, Amelisyn sought to claim the essence for herself to become a god, and in 1369 she convinced the 5 most powerful Bhaalspawn to ally together to find and destroy all of the weaker spawn in exchange for her granting them the power of demigods once she ascended. Eventually, all the Bhaalspawn were killed except for Abdel Adrian, a good-aligned person who thwarted Amelisyn, and instead of keeping the power and becoming the Lord of Murder himself, Abdel had the divine essence hidden away in Mount Celestia. He then went to Candlekeep to live a quiet life of contemplation, and Bhaal's plan to be resurrected had failed, presumably. Bane's return. Iactu Zvim, Bane's son, was also killed during the Time of Troubles, but instead of truly dying, his essence was imprisoned within an ancient magic circle under Zhentil Keep. Some sages speculate Ea was responsible for this to prevent the godling from gaining more power. After the events of the Bane Death, Zvim made contact with several former Baneite priests. After several years of deliberating, many former Baneites began worshipping Iactu Zvim as the rightful heir to Bane. With their help, in 1369, Zvim broke out of his prison and claimed the portfolios of tyranny, strife, and hatred from the severely weakened Cyric, and convinced many Cyricists to switch to his worship. Just 3 years later, in 1372, Zvim was consumed in green fire, from which emerged Bane, resurrected through his spawn. Nearly all of these Zvimites returned to worshipping Bane, but a few remained devout to Iactu Zvim, who still sends visions and grants spells to this day. While Myrkul and Bhaal will remain dead for another century, Bane actually did pretty well for himself. He regained most of his followers from Zvim and Cyric. He reformed his church to no longer allow infighting, forcing them to all obey the hierarchy and orders of their superiors, making his church much more effective. He reestablished old alliances with Loviatar, Mask, and Talana. He was summoned by Zaz-Tam in 1385 and made a deal, giving Zaz the power to wield magic in the wake of the Spell Plague, in exchange for Zaz-Tam's soul in 1,000 years, and for making Bane the primary god worshipped in all of Thay, substantially expanding his worshipper count. The Spell Plague removed his 2 biggest enemies, Mystra and Cyric, while doing basically nothing to him. His power further increased throughout the century, and he was able to conquer the Goblinoid Pantheon and enslave one of Tiamat's avatars, who fell into Banehold when Dragon Eyrie was destroyed. Around the time of the Second Sundering, so around 1486 DR, Tiamat, who had been biding her time waiting for the perfect moment, escaped Bane's enslavement by attacking and significantly draining his divine power. It's unclear if Bane still rules over the Goblinoid Pantheon, but given how much weaker he is in 5th edition, the fact that 5th edition tried to return the Forgotten Realms to the pre-Spell Plague status quo, and the fact that it's never mentioned in 5th edition, I would assume he's not. Bhaal's return. As I said earlier, the last remaining Bhaalspawn, Abdel Adrian, decided to give up Bhaal's essence and live a peaceful life in Candlekeep. Unbeknownst to Abdel, Bhaal's vestige still lied within his mind, and actually made the decision to give up the essence for him, Bhaal taking the essence for himself as part of his long-term plan to resurrect himself. He then subtly influenced him to leave Candlekeep and move to Baldur's Gate, enlist in the Flaming Fist, and ascend the ranks, getting involved in politics. When the Marshal of the Flaming Fist was killed, Abdel took over and was granted the title of Duke. In 1482, Abdel was giving a speech to a large crowd of Baldurians when Vikang, the only other surviving Bhaalspawn, attacked Abdel, which resulted in a bloody battle where one killed the other. No one is sure of who was victorious, but the victor was transformed into an avatar of Bhaal called the Bhaalspawn Slayer. This avatar was killed by the Flaming Fist, but the Lord of Murder had been revived. Myrkul's return. As stated earlier, Myrkul's essence moved into the Crown of Horns and Blackstaff Tower. He was capable of teleporting it to wherever he wanted, and he spent his time spreading evil throughout the realms by tormenting Cyricists and hapless innocents alike. He continued to have worshippers, albeit few, called the Horned Harbingers, who were Myrkulites that at some point had touched the Crown of Horns, granting them powers. One of these Horned Harbingers was the Wanti pureblood Nerys Dahothek, who lived in Skullport beneath Waterdeep. He was transformed into a lich by the Crown in 1370 and then disappeared, and he was the last being known to be in possession of the Crown of Horns. Just like many gods, Myrkul was restored to being a deity around the Second Sundering in the 1480s. Like Bane and Bhaal, Myrkul had contingencies in play in case he died, but unlike Bane and Bhaal, we have absolutely no information on what this involved or how he was resurrected. In fact, we have no information on where the Crown of Horns was or what Myrkul was up to since 1370 DR, over 100 years ago, but I assume his resurrection probably involved the Crown of Horns somehow. So, as of the current 5th edition time period of the 1490s DR, where are the Dead Three now? Well, when Ao reforged the Tablets of Fate, separating Abir and Toril again in what is called the Second Sundering, most gods became quieter, withdrawing their direct influence from the world. According to the adventure Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, the Dead Three decided to stay behind on Toril as quasi-divine mortals, presumably so that they can influence the world more than they could as gods. The exact quote is this: "While the Sundering saw the other gods of the Forgotten Realms withdraw their direct influence from the world, the Dead Three remained behind in mortal form as quasi-divine beings. While their power has diminished, they remain a formidable trio and play a malevolent role in influencing events on Toril." End quote. Now, these two sentences have some major implications and truthfully don't make much sense to me, but I'm going to do my best to rationalize it. So, the main thing that strikes me as odd is that they volunteered to weaken themselves and become mortals. The Dark Three spent their entire mortal lives slaying primordials and waging wars so that they could become gods, because they were just that goddamn power hungry. Then, as gods, they spent most of their time scheming together to try and become more powerful, such as the entire Time of Troubles arc. Yet, you're telling me these ambitious, power-hungry mortals turn to gods, including Bane, who is literally a god of tyrants and power-hungry bad guys, just chose to lose their divine status and become weakened mortals? That just makes no sense to me and seems like such an out-of-character choice for all three of them. So I have two explanations that I have come up with for this. So one way to view it is that after the Sundering, Ao stopped allowing gods to influence mortals as directly as they used to be able to. The Dead Three, now weakened significantly, don't like that because it means the various schemes they have to gain more divine power won't be allowed. So they choose to weaken themselves, so that they are no longer considered full-fledged gods and are technically mortals. This means they are no longer subjected to Ao's decree of gods not directly influencing Toril, and they are free to pursue pursue their schemes. Then they will scheme to gain more divine power, catapulting them back to full-fledged deities, but even more powerful than they were before. It's like the whole concept of you need to spend money to make money. By giving up a little bit of divine power, they can hopefully, if their plans succeed, become even more powerful. Now, this is not explicitly mentioned anywhere, and I'm not even sure AO is preventing gods from directly influencing things. I just know that the Sword Coast Adventures guide says the gods are quieter now, so I just kind of am assuming AO's responsible for that. This is just one possible headcanon to explain this extremely odd and out-of-character move on their part. If you've been a Forgotten Realms fan for long, you'll understand that a big part of it is reconciling contradictions in the lore. Another explanation I thought of is that maybe Descent into Avernus is wrong. They didn't voluntarily lose their power. It was against their will. Bane was turned to mortal form from Tiamat draining his divine essence, and Bhaal and Myrkul are weakened mortals because they just got resurrected. Now, plenty of gods that got resurrected in the Sundering are back at full god level power, but we don't know the conditions of their resurrection, so maybe they had better contingency plans, or maybe Lord AO just did it for them. So maybe Bhaal and Myrkul's resurrection contingencies were just weaker. Now you might be thinking, well Sean, the book clearly says that they chose to weaken themselves. Well, I'm proposing that that is propaganda. That is what the Dead Three tell their clergy so that they don't seem weak. They don't want their clergy to know that their plans failed and that they are weak. Oh no, I didn't lose my power. I actually gave it up on purpose because it's all part of my convoluted plan to get even more power. Yeah, totally on purpose, guys. I mean, that's the exact kind of move the Dead Three would make. Regardless of which explanation you use, the Dead Three are most definitely scheming to gain more divine power. So if you want to incorporate this into your D&D campaign and want some ideas on what kind of schemes the Dead Three could get up to in order to recoup their lost power, maybe it could involve finding the 7 lost gods that they enslaved and using them to conquer and slaughter areas around the Moon Sea, gaining power through worship, conquest, and mass sacrifice. If you want to know what I'm talking about, you should check out my video on how the Dead Three became gods and my video on the 7 lost gods to learn more about that. The other thing that confuses me is, what about their divine realms? Most gods have a divine realm, basically their home that they dwell on in the outer planes, and it's also the place that the souls of their worshippers go to when they die. But if the Dead Three are living on the material plane, that means they're not in their divine realms. So are their divine realms being watched over by loyal servants? If so, what's stopping those servants from taking over the realm for themselves? Has another god taken over their now empty realms? What happens to their worshippers when they die? Where would they go if there's no divine realm? I understand that the afterlife is not supposed to be a fully fleshed out thing with extravagant detail, that it's supposed to be fairly vague and mysterious, since mortals in universe know very little about it, and if a player character in a campaign dies, that's usually the end of their story, or they get resurrected. Most campaigns aren't really supposed to go into the afterlife. However, plane shifting's a thing, and planescape's a thing, so you can go there. And these kinds of questions were answered in 2nd edition Planescape. Planescape got very in-depth on divine realms in the afterlife, but 5th edition almost never touches it. I mean, other than Tiamat and a few gods in the Outlands from the new Planescape book, 5th edition never really tells you where a god's divine realm is in the first place. Sure, you can look at older editions, but the cosmologies and planes keep changing between each edition, so who's to say which, if any, are true in 5th edition? I mean, 5th edition uses the Great Wheel, so you could assume that the 2nd edition stuff is true since that also uses the Great Wheel, but 5th edition also keeps a lot of 4th edition cosmological changes such as the Feywild, the Shadowfell, and the Elemental Chaos, so really who's to say? Anyways, that last one was more of a nitpick, but I felt compelled to share it. That is the history of the Dead Three from the moment that they ascended to the current time period. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and remember to subscribe for more D&D lore.